It is August 1914, and in a recruitment office on the Strand in London, a 23-year-old clerk named Edward Brittain is signing his name on a piece of paper that will change everything. His hand shakes slightly, not from fear, from something closer to relief. Outside, the streets are full of men doing the same thing. Queues stretch around corners. Bands play. Women hand out white feathers to men not yet in uniform. Everyone believes the war will be over by Christmas. Edward knows something most of them do not. He knows that the man standing 3 places behind him in this queue, a university friend named Victor Richardson, is the reason he is here at all. And he knows that Victor knows, and neither of them will ever say it out loud. Because in 1914, there are things you simply do not name. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. If this story is pulling you in, the like and subscribe buttons are quietly there for you. Only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you are tonight and what time it is for you. It is always something to see who is out there listening at the same hour I am recording. For most of history, men like Edward and Victor were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why hundreds of thousands of gay men enlisted in a war they did not have to fight, what it felt like to love another soldier in a trench where privacy did not exist, and what the British Army did when it discovered 2 men in a dugout at 3 in the morning with their uniforms unbuttoned. So settle in. Dim the lights if you need to. This is going to take a while. Congratulations. You have just woken up in the summer of 1914, and Europe is about to tear itself apart. The air smells like coal smoke and horses and something electric that no one can quite name. It is the smell of an entire generation walking toward the cliff edge. Welcome. Let us start with the thing no one talks about. The First World War sent roughly 9 million men into trenches across France and Belgium. Historians have spent a century counting the dead, mapping the battles, analysing the strategy. What they have spent considerably less time discussing is the fact that a significant portion of those 9 million men were gay. We do not have exact numbers. We will never have exact numbers, but we have letters. We have diaries. We have court-martial records. We have enough to know that when the British Army called for volunteers in 1914, tens of thousands of men who loved other men answered that call. And they did it for reasons more complicated than patriotism. Some went because everyone else was going. Some went because staying home meant questions they could not answer. Some went because the alternative was a clerk job in a city where everyone knew everyone and privacy was a fantasy. And some went because the war offered something almost unthinkable, a world where you could live alongside other men, sleep beside them, wash beside them, write to them, grieve for them, and no one would ask why. Edward Brittain survived the war. His friend Victor Richardson did not. In 1918, 3 years after Victor was killed on the Italian front, Edward sat down and wrote a letter to Victor's mother. He told her that Victor had been the most important person in his life, that he thought of him every day, that he did not believe he would ever feel that way about anyone else. The letter still exists. It is careful. It is coded. And if you know what you are looking for, it is absolutely unmistakable. Edward was not unique. He was one of thousands. Let us talk about what it meant to be a gay man in Britain in 1914. Legally, it meant you were a criminal. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885 had made all sexual contact between men punishable by up to 2 years of hard labour. The law did not require proof of sodomy. It did not require witnesses to an actual act. Gross indecency was enough, which meant that 2 men seen leaving a hotel together, 2 men caught kissing in a park, 2 men living in the same flat for too long without a clear reason, could be arrested, tried, and imprisoned. Oscar Wilde had been convicted under this law in 1895. Everyone knew what happened to Oscar Wilde. Socially, it meant you lived in a permanent state of performance. You learned which clubs were safe. You learned which pubs had back rooms. You learned how to read a glance, how to recognize another man like you in a crowd, how to have an entire conversation with your eyes while talking about the weather. You learned how to destroy letters, how to lie to landladies, how to explain why you were 35 and still unmarried. You learned that the wrong word to the wrong person could end your career, your reputation, your life as you knew it. And then the war started, and suddenly the British Army was begging for men. Any men, all men. As long as you were between 18 and 41, as long as you could pass a medical exam that mostly checked whether you had teeth and feet, you were welcome. No one asked about your personal life. No one cared. The recruiter in the office on the Strand did not ask Edward Brittain whether he had ever loved a woman. He asked whether Edward could march 10 miles and fire a rifle. Edward said yes. The recruiter handed him a shilling and told him to report to a training camp in Surrey in 3 days. For a certain kind of man, this was freedom, not freedom from danger. The Western Front was the most industrialized killing field in human history, but freedom from scrutiny, freedom from the constant fear that someone might notice, freedom, for the first time in their lives, to be surrounded by other men without needing an excuse. Let me be clear about something. The British Army in 1914 was not a tolerant institution. It was not a safe space. The same laws that criminalized gay men in civilian life applied in the military. Article 66 of the Army Act made sodomy punishable by court-martial, imprisonment, and discharge with ignominy. If you were caught, you were destroyed. The difference was that in the chaos of war, in the filth and noise and horror of the trenches, it was much, much harder to get caught. And the men who went knew that. The writer and poet Siegfried Sassoon enlisted in August 1914. He was 27. He was already writing poetry. He was already aware that he was attracted to men and not to women. His diary from that summer is remarkably honest about his reasons for joining up. He wrote that civilian life felt like a cage, that he could not bear another year of pretending, that the idea of spending the war in England, watching other men leave, felt like a kind of death. So he joined the Royal Welch Fusiliers and went to France. And for 2 years, despite the shells and the gas and the mud, he was happier than he had ever been. He was not alone in that feeling. The poet Wilfred Owen enlisted in 1915. He was 22, shy, uncertain about almost everything, except his love of poetry and his attraction to other men. He had spent his adolescence convinced he was broken. The war did not fix that. But it gave him a context. It gave him other men who understood what it felt like to be afraid, to be tender, to love something you were not supposed to love. Owen's letters to his mother are full of careful deflections. His letters to fellow officers are full of something else. In 1917, he wrote to a young officer named Charles Scott Moncrief, describing another soldier as having eyes like dark wounds and a mouth made for better things than war. The letter was not subtle. Scott Moncrief wrote back. They understood each other perfectly. This is the thing about the First World War that most histories skip over. It was not just a place where gay men existed. It was a place where gay men found each other. The structure of trench warfare made this possible in a way that civilian life never could. You lived with the same 30 to 40 men for weeks at a time. You slept in the same dugout. You ate together, washed together, wrote letters side by side, waited for the next bombardment together. The boundaries that normally kept men apart dissolved. Physical closeness was not suspicious. It was mandatory. If you wanted to survive, you learned to trust the man next to you with your life, and sometimes that trust became something more. The historian Emma Vickers spent years working through the British National Archives, reading court-martial records from the First World War. She found roughly 130 cases of soldiers tried for gross indecency or sodomy between 1914 and 1918. Which sounds like a lot until you realize that the British Army fielded more than 5 million men during that period. 130 cases out of 5 million. Either gay soldiers were extraordinarily rare, or they were extraordinarily careful. The evidence suggests the latter. Most of the men who were caught were not caught because of anything they did in the trenches. They were caught in hospitals, in training camps, in rest billets behind the lines where there was enough privacy for something to actually happen and enough oversight for someone to notice. The front itself, paradoxically, was safer, because at the front, Everyone was too tired, too scared, and too focused on staying alive to care what two men were doing in the dark. But let us not romanticize this. The trenches were hell. They were cold, wet, muddy, lice-infested, rat-infested, shell-shocked nightmares, where men watched their friends die in ways that should not be possible. The fact that some of those men also fell in love with each other does not make the trenches any less horrific. It just makes those men human. Edward Brittain met Victor Richardson at Oxford in 1913. They were both studying classics. They were both trying to figure out what to do with their lives. Edward's sister Vera later wrote that Victor was the only person who ever made her brother laugh. The two of them spent the summer of 1914 hiking in the Lake District, sleeping in the same tent, swimming in the same cold lakes, talking late into the night about everything except the thing they both knew. When war was declared in August, they enlisted on the same day. Not together. That would have looked too deliberate, but within hours of each other. They were assigned to different units. Edward went to the Sherwood Foresters. Victor went to the Rifle Brigade. They wrote to each other constantly. The letters do not survive. Vera Brittain mentions them in her memoir, Testament of Youth, but says her brother destroyed them before he died, which tells you everything you need to know about what was in them. Victor was sent to the Italian front in 1915. Edward was sent to France. They saw each other once more, briefly, during a leave in London in early 1916. Vera described them sitting together in the family drawing room, not talking, just sitting. She said she felt like she was intruding. 3 months later, Victor was killed during an assault on the Austrian line near Asiago. He was 22. Edward received the news in a letter from another officer. He did not speak for 2 days. When he finally did, he told his sister that he had lost the only person who mattered. He went back to the front a week later. He survived until 1918, when he was shot by a sniper while attempting to repair a communications line. He died in a field hospital in Italy. He was 25. The last letter found in his uniform pocket was addressed to Victor's mother. These men were not abstractions. They were not symbols. They were real people who loved each other and died before they had the chance to figure out what that love could become. Now let us talk about what love actually looked like in the trenches. Because the reality was messy and complicated, and nothing like the tidy narratives we tell ourselves about wartime romance. There was no privacy. None. You lived in a hole in the ground with 15 other men. You slept shoulder to shoulder. You used a latrine that was a wooden plank over a pit 20 feet from where you ate. You washed, when you washed at all, in a bucket of cold water that 6 other men had already used. If you wanted to touch another man, if you wanted to kiss him, if you wanted anything more than that, you had to wait, and hope, and find a moment when no one else was looking. Most of the time, that moment never came. So what you had instead were letters. Letters were everything. The British Postal Service delivered mail to the front lines with staggering efficiency. A letter sent from London on Monday could reach a trench in France by Thursday. Soldiers wrote home constantly, to mothers, to wives, to sisters, to friends, and some of them wrote to other soldiers, in language that sounds, to a modern ear, almost unbelievably intimate. The historian Santanu Das analysed thousands of letters written by British soldiers during the First World War. He found patterns, certain phrases that appeared again and again in letters between men. My dear boy, I think of you constantly. I miss you more than I can say. Your last letter kept me alive through the worst of it. I would give anything to see you again. I hope you think of me as I think of you. These phrases were not, on their own, proof of anything. Men in the Edwardian era wrote to each other with an emotional openness that feels foreign now. Close male friendships were expected to be intense, affectionate, physically demonstrative. 2 men could share a bed, hold hands, embrace, write each other love poetry, and as long as nothing explicitly sexual happened, society considered it normal, which gave gay men an enormous amount of cover. You could write I love you to another man, and everyone would assume you meant it platonically, even if you did not. But some letters were not ambiguous. Some letters said things that could not be explained away. In 1917, a young officer named Robert Graves received a letter from Siegfried Sassoon that included the line, "I want you here with me more than I want anything else in this world, and I'm not talking about the war." Graves, who was not gay but was deeply fond of Sassoon, wrote back with a gentle deflection. Sassoon wrote again, more carefully. The two of them remained friends for the rest of their lives, but the letters from that period make it very clear that Sassoon wanted something Graves could not give him. Sassoon eventually found what he was looking for. In 1917, he was sent to a military hospital in Scotland to recover from shell shock. There he met Wilfred Owen. Owen was also recovering from shell shock. He was also a poet. He was also, though he had never said it out loud to anyone, attracted to men. The two of them spent hours together, walking the hospital grounds, talking about poetry, reading each other's drafts. Owen later described those months as the happiest of his life. Sassoon called Owen the only person who ever understood what he was trying to say. Were they lovers? We do not know. The evidence is inconclusive. What we do know is that Owen's poetry changed after he met Sassoon. It became more confident, more honest, more willing to name the tenderness he felt for other soldiers. His poem Disabled ends with a young wounded soldier remembering how, before the war, girls had looked at him with desire. Now, he writes, only men touch him, and only to move his wheelchair. The poem aches with loss, not just the loss of his body, the loss of being wanted. Another poem, Arms and the Boy, lingers on the beauty of a young soldier's fingers, his cheek, the curve of his mouth. Owen describes these things with the attention of someone who has looked at them for a long time, who has memorized them. The poem is ostensibly about the violence of war, about innocence destroyed, but it is also about desire, about noticing another man's body in a way that has nothing to do with violence. Owen was killed 1 week before the armistice. He was 25. Sassoon survived and spent the rest of his life trying to honor Owen's memory. He edited Owen's poems. He wrote about him constantly. He never said outright that he had loved him, but anyone reading those memoirs can feel it in every line. This is what gay soldiers had. Not safety, not certainty, just moments, letters, glances, the knowledge that someone else out there understood, and sometimes, rarely, more than that. Sometimes two men found a way to be alone, a supply dugout, a ruined farmhouse, a shell crater far enough from the line that no one would come looking. We know this happened because we have the court-martial records of the men who were caught. In March 1916, 2 privates in the Lancashire Fusiliers were discovered by a sergeant in a storage dugout near Ypres. The report is clinical. The men were found in a state of undress. They admitted to improper conduct. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years hard labour. They were sent to military prisons in England, discharged with ignominy, and released in 1918 with criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The report does not name them. It does not describe what they looked like, how old they were, whether they had known each other before the war. It reduces them to a case number and a crime, but they were real. They took the risk. They knew what would happen if they were caught, and they decided the risk was worth it. That tells you something about how desperate they were to touch each other, to be, for 10 minutes, honest. Not all of the relationships that formed in the trenches were sexual. Most were not, but they were still love. The kind of love that reorganizes a life, the kind that makes everything else feel secondary. In 1915, a working-class soldier named Stephen Hewitt was assigned to a unit in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was 24. He had grown up in the East End of London, left school at 14, worked as a shop assistant. He had never been more than 20 miles from home before the war. He had certainly never met anyone like the man who became his tent mate in a field hospital near Arras. His name was James Beaumont. He was 31, university educated, the son of a vicar. Under normal circumstances, the two of them would never have spoken. The British class system in 1915 was a wall as solid as anything built of stone. But in the middle of a war, in a tent full of dying men, class stopped mattering quite as much. Hewitt and Beaumont worked 16-hour shifts together. They hauled stretchers. They held men down during amputations. They wrote letters for soldiers too wounded to hold a pen. And at night, When the tent finally went quiet, they sat outside and talked. Beaumont taught Hewitt to read poetry. Hewitt taught Beaumont how to pick a lock, how to steal cigarettes from the supply depot, how to survive on nothing. They became inseparable. Hewitt's letters home to his sister are full of Beaumont. He mentions him in almost every paragraph. Mr. Beaumont says this. Mr. Beaumont thinks that. Mr. Beaumont stayed up all night with a boy from Essex who kept crying for his mother. The letters are not romantic in the way we would recognize now. They are something else. They are the letters of someone who has found a person who makes the world make sense. Beaumont survived the war. Hewitt did not. In 1918, during the final German offensive, a shell hit the field hospital. Hewitt was outside at the time, carrying a stretcher. He was killed instantly. Beaumont was inside. He survived with minor injuries. After the war, he went home to Cambridgeshire, became a schoolteacher, never married. In 1965, a local historian interviewed him for an oral history project about the war. Beaumont was 81. When asked about his most significant memory of the conflict, he said, without hesitation, "A shop boy from London named Stephen Hewitt, who taught me that education has nothing to do with books." The historian asked if they had stayed in touch after the war. Beaumont said Stephen had been killed in 1918. Then he stood up and said the interview was over. He died 3 months later. Among his possessions, his niece found a single photograph of 2 men in medical corps uniforms standing outside a tent. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Stephen and James, Arras, 1916. That photograph still exists. It is in the Imperial War Museum. If you ever go to London, you can ask to see it. The 2 men are not touching. They are standing about a foot apart, hands at their sides, looking at the camera with the careful blankness that everyone wore in photographs from that era. But their shoulders are angled toward each other, just slightly, just enough." Now let us talk about the military's official position on all of this, because the British Army knew, of course. Institutions always know. The question is what they choose to do with the knowledge. The Manual of Military Law, issued to every officer in 1914, was very clear. Sodomy was a crime under Article 66 of the Army Act. Gross indecency was a crime under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Both were punishable by court-martial. The manual devoted 3 pages to defining what counted as evidence, what counted as proof, and what officers were required to do if they suspected improper conduct between soldiers. In practice, officers did almost nothing. Because prosecuting soldiers for sexual offences in the middle of a war was a bureaucratic nightmare that no one wanted to deal with. It required witnesses. It required testimony. It required sending the accused back to England for trial, which meant losing manpower. And it risked exposing the fact that this was not an isolated problem, that there were a lot of men in the trenches who loved other men. Enough that if you started prosecuting them all, you would have to court-martial half the army. So the unspoken policy became this: if you were discreet, if you did not make it obvious, if you did not get caught in a way that forced someone to write a report, the army would look the other way. It was the same policy that had governed British society for decades. We will not ask, you will not tell, and everyone will pretend this is not happening. But discretion was a moving target. What counted as discreet depended entirely on who was watching. In 1916, an officer named Cecil Stewart was removed from his command in the Middlesex Regiment. There was no court-martial, no formal accusation. He was simply transferred to a logistics unit in Cairo and told he was no longer welcome at the front. The reason, according to a letter from his commanding officer to the War Office, was that Stewart had been observed showing excessive favouritism toward a young private in his unit. The letter is careful. It does not accuse Stewart of anything illegal. It does not use the word indecency. It says only that Stewart's conduct had become the subject of talk among the men, and that his continued presence was detrimental to morale. Stewart spent the rest of the war in Cairo, filing reports about supply chains. He was never charged with a crime, but his career was over. After the war, he tried to return to his pre-war profession as a solicitor. No firm would hire him. The letter from his commanding officer had followed him. Everyone in his social circle knew why he had been transferred. He ended up emigrating to Australia in 1923. There is no record of what happened to him after that. The private he had supposedly favoured was killed at the Somme 3 months after Stewart was removed. His name was Thomas Crane. He was 19. This is the thing about discretion as a survival strategy. It only works if the people in power decide to let it work, and they can revoke that decision at any moment, for any reason, with no warning. Most officers did let it work, because most officers had bigger problems to worry about. Keeping men alive, keeping them fed, keeping them from mutinying when ordered to go over the top into machine gun fire for the 6th time in a week. Whether 2 of those men were sleeping together in a dugout was simply not a priority. But some officers cared, either because they were genuinely scandalized, or because they saw an opportunity to settle a personal grudge, or because they were terrified someone might think they were complicit. And when those officers decided to care, men died. Not in battle, in prisons, in disgrace, alone. The court-martial records are fragmentary. The National Archives has roughly 130 cases from the entire war, but historians estimate the real number is higher. Some cases were handled informally. Some records were destroyed. Some men were simply shot for cowardice or desertion when the real reason for their execution was something the army did not want to name in an official document. We know this happened because of a case that survived by accident. In 1917, a private named Harold Malins was executed by firing squad for desertion. The official record says he abandoned his post during an attack and was found hiding in a farmhouse 3 miles behind the lines. But a letter from a nurse who treated him in a field hospital the month before tells a different story. She wrote that Malins had been caught with another soldier in circumstances she did not feel comfortable describing, that he had been threatened with court-martial but told the charges would be dropped if he volunteered for a suicide mission during the next offensive, that he had refused, that he had been labelled a deserter and shot. The nurse's letter was never meant to be public. It was found in a private collection in the 1990s. The historian Graham Willett published it in a 2003 article on military justice during the First World War. Malins was 23 when he was executed. The other soldier was never named. How many other men died that way? We do not know. We will never know. The records are gone. The witnesses are dead. All we have are fragments. Letters that mention things obliquely. Diaries with pages torn out. Photographs with faces scratched away. The archive of gay soldiers in the First World War is an archive of erasure. What survived, survived by accident. But some things did survive. And some of them are extraordinary. There is a diary in the British Library, catalogued under Manuscript Collection 5/8042. It belonged to a lieutenant named Philip Bainbrig. He served with the Royal Field Artillery from 1914 to 1918. He survived the war, went home to Shropshire, worked as an accountant, and died in 1953. The diary was donated to the library in 1987 by his nephew, who said he had found it in a trunk in Philip's attic and had no idea what it contained. What it contains is 4 years of entries written in a code that took researchers 8 years to break. Bainbrig had invented his own cipher, not a complicated one. He had simply reversed the alphabet, so A became Z, B became Y, and so on. Simple enough that once you knew the key, you could read it easily, but opaque enough that a casual reader would have no idea what they were looking at. The decoded diary is one of the most detailed accounts of gay life in the trenches that we have. Bainbrig wrote almost every day. He wrote about the weather, the food, the bombardments, the men he served with, and he wrote about the men he loved. There were 3 of them over the course of the war. He gives them initials, LKM. He describes meeting L in a training camp in 1914, spending a night with him in a barn near Dover before they shipped out to France. He describes watching L die at Ypres in 1915, shot through the chest while trying to drag another man back to the trench. He describes sitting with the body for an hour before anyone came to take it away. He met Kay in 1916. Kay was a signaller, 21 years old. Bainbrig was 26. They were stationed at the same artillery battery near Albert for 4 months. The diary entries from that period are the longest in the entire collection. Bainbrig describes Kay's hands, his voice, the way he looked when he smiled. He describes stealing moments together, a walk through a ruined orchard, a conversation in a shell crater, an evening in a farmhouse cellar where they were supposed to be checking the maps, but instead sat on the floor and talked until someone called them back to the line. In September 1916, Kay was transferred to another unit. Bainbrig never saw him again. The diary says he tried to find out what happened to Kay after the war, but could not. No record, no trace, just gone. M appears in 1917. The entries about M are different, shorter, more cautious. Bainbrig knew by then that anything he wrote could be found, could be used against him. He says only that M understood, that they had an agreement, that he was grateful. M survived. Bainbrig survived. The diary's final entry is from November 1918. The war is over. Bainbrig is on a train back to England. He writes that he does not know what happens next, that the war was the only time in his life he felt like himself, that he is terrified of going back to a world where he has to hide again. The entry ends mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. Researchers tried to find out if Bainbrig ever contacted M after the war. They found nothing, no letters, no records. If the two of them stayed in touch, they hid it well. What we do have is the diary, and the fact that Bainbrig kept it, that he encoded it, yes, but also that he did not destroy it. He could have. He had decades to burn it, to bury it, to tear it apart and scatter the pieces. But he kept it in a trunk in his attic for 35 years. And when he died, he left it there for his nephew to find. Maybe he wanted someone, eventually, to know. Maybe he thought enough time would pass that it would be safe. Maybe he just could not bring himself to erase the only proof that L and K and M had existed, that they had mattered, that for 4 years in the middle of the worst war in human history, he had loved and been loved in return. Now let us talk about what happened when the war ended. Because for gay soldiers, the armistice was not the relief it was for everyone else. It was the end of the only freedom they had ever known. In November 1918, the fighting stopped. The soldiers came home. Parades, celebrations, families reunited, men trying to figure out how to live in a world that was not actively trying to kill them. And for gay soldiers, the question was always the same. What now? Some of them tried to stay close to the men they had loved during the war. They moved to the same cities. They found jobs near each other. They invented excuses to see each other. Old army friends catching up. No one thought twice about it. 2 veterans meeting for a pint every Thursday evening was normal. Expected even. As long as they were careful, they could build a life that looked from the outside like friendship. And on the inside was something else entirely. But most of them could not. Because most of them went home to families, to towns, to jobs where everyone knew them. Where 2 men living together would be noticed. Where letters would be read. Where privacy was impossible. So they went back to hiding. Back to the same careful performance they had lived before the war. Except now it was harder. Because now they knew what it felt like to not have to hide. And they had to live the rest of their lives knowing they would never feel that way again. Siegfried Sassoon went home to England and spent the next decade trying to be straight. He dated women. He got engaged twice. He broke off both engagements. In 1933, at the age of 47, he married a woman named Hester Gatty. They had 1 son. The marriage was miserable. Hester later said that Sassoon had been in love with someone else the entire time, and that she had known it from the beginning, but thought she could change him. She could not. They separated in 1945. Sassoon spent the last 22 years of his life alone, writing memoirs about the war. He never named the men he had loved, but he wrote about them constantly, in code, in metaphor, in the same careful language he had used in the trenches. Wilfred Owen did not have to make that choice. He was killed a week before the armistice. He was 25. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on November 11th, 1918, the same day the church bells rang to celebrate the end of the war. She said later that she heard the bells and thought, for one moment, that it meant he was coming home. Then she opened the door and saw the messenger. Owen's poems were not widely read during his lifetime. He had published only 5. The rest existed in notebooks, in letters, in drafts he had sent to Sassoon for feedback. After his death, Sassoon collected them, edited them, published them, spent years making sure the world knew Wilfred Owen's name. It was the only thing he could do, the only way he had to honour what Owen had meant to him. The poems made Owen famous. They are taught in schools now. Dulci et decorum est, Anthem for Doomed Youth, Strange Meeting. Every British teenager reads them, and most of those teenagers have no idea that the man who wrote them was gay, that the tenderness in those poems, the attention to the bodies of young soldiers, the rage at a world that sent beautiful boys to die, came from a man who loved other men and had no language to say it except through poetry. That erasure is not an accident. It is a choice, made over and over again by editors, by teachers, by historians who decide that Owen's sexuality is not relevant to his work, that it is a distraction, that what matters is the universal human experience of war, not the specific queer experience of loving someone you are not supposed to love while the world is ending around you. But you cannot separate those things. Owen's queerness is not incidental to his poetry. It is central. The reason his poems ache the way they do is because he was writing about men he loved, in a voice he could never use in life. The poems were the only place he could be honest, and even there he had to be careful. Robert Graves went home and wrote memoirs. He became one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. He wrote about the war constantly. He wrote about Sassoon. He called him one of the great friends of his life. He described their time together in France as a kind of Eden. And he never once said that Sassoon had been in love with him. Maybe he did not know. Maybe he knew and chose not to say. Either way, the result is the same. Sassoon disappears from his own story, becomes a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The man who loved him gets to control how that love is remembered. This happened again and again. Gay soldiers who survived the war found themselves erased from the history of that survival. Their letters were destroyed. Their diaries were edited. Their relationships were reframed as friendships. And the men who did the erasing were often the people who loved them. Families who could not bear the scandal. Executors who thought they were protecting a reputation. Archivists who decided that certain truths were better left buried. The historian Joanna Bork has written extensively about this. She points out that we have thousands of letters between male soldiers during the First World War that use language of intense romantic affection. But the moment those letters enter an archive, they are labelled as examples of wartime camaraderie, proof of the deep bonds between men in battle, which is true, but it is not the whole truth. Some of those letters were written by men who were in love, and the refusal to even consider that possibility is a form of violence. It tells gay soldiers a century later that their experiences do not count, that their love was not real, that they can be honoured as soldiers but not as the men they actually were. But some evidence survived anyway, because some people refused to erase. Edward Brittain's sister Vera spent decades trying to understand why her brother had been so devastated by Victor Richardson's death. She read their letters. She talked to men who had served with them, and eventually she understood. In her memoir, Testament of Youth, she does not say it outright. She could not. The book was published in 1933, when homosexuality was still illegal, but she comes as close as she can. She writes that Edward and Victor had a friendship that was one of the deepest things in his life. That after Victor died, Edward was never the same, that he carried something he could never speak about. And then she adds, carefully, that there are kinds of love the world does not have language for, that soldiers understood things about each other that families could not see, It is the closest a straight woman in 1933 could come to saying her brother was gay. And she said it. She put it in print. She made sure the world knew that Edward's grief was not just the grief of losing a friend. It was the grief of losing the person he loved most. And she honoured that, even though she could not name it, even though doing so risked her own reputation. Vera Brittain died in 1970. She never met another gay person who had read Testament of Youth and understood what she had been trying to say, or if she did, no one recorded it. But the book has been in print for 90 years, and every few years, someone reads it and recognises Edward's story, recognises the careful language, the coded grief, and realises they are not the first person to love someone they could not name. That erasure, that careful reframing of love as friendship, happened at every level of the historical record. But it was not universal. Some gay soldiers left evidence so clear, so undeniable, that even a century of determined archivists could not explain it away. In the Imperial War Museum in London, there is a collection of letters donated in 1994 by the family of a man named Geoffrey Thompson. Thompson served as a captain in the East Yorkshire Regiment from 1915 to 1919. He survived the war, returned to England, and worked as a schoolteacher in Leeds until his death in 1968. He never married. His family described him as a very private man who did not talk much about the war. When they donated his papers to the museum, they had not read the letters. They assumed they were standard war correspondence, updates about troop movements, requests for supplies, the usual. The museum archivist read them and realized immediately that they were something else entirely. The letters span 3 years, from 1916 to 1918. They are all addressed to the same person, a lieutenant named Arthur Glynn. Glynn served in the same regiment as Thompson. The two of them met during training in Yorkshire in early 1916. By March of that year, Thompson was writing letters that began, "My dearest Arthur," and ended, "Yours always," with a love that grows every day we are apart. The letters are not subtle. Thompson writes about missing Arthur's touch, about lying awake at night, thinking of the last time they were alone together, about counting the days until they would be stationed at the same position again. In one letter from July 1916, Thompson describes a dream he had in which the war was over and the two of them were living together in a cottage by the sea. He writes, "I know it is foolish to imagine such things. I know the world would never allow it. But in my mind at least, I can pretend we have a future." In another letter, from December 1917, Thompson writes about watching another officer be court-martialed for gross indecency. He does not name the officer, but he writes, "I thought of us. I thought of how easily that could be our fate, and I realized I do not care. If loving you is a crime, then I am guilty. And I would rather be guilty and have known you than innocent and alone." Arthur Glynn survived the war. So did Geoffrey Thompson. The letters suggest they tried to stay together afterward. In the final letter in the collection, dated March 1919, Thompson writes that he has found a teaching position in Leeds, and that there is another position available at the same school if Arthur is interested. He writes, "We could take rooms near each other. No one would think it strange. Two veterans, helping each other adjust to civilian life. It is the best I can offer, but it is something. There is no record of whether Arthur took the position. The museum has no further letters, but researchers found a staff list from the school where Thompson taught. In 1921, an Arthur Glynn was hired to teach mathematics. He stayed for 3 years, then moved to London in 1924. Thompson stayed in Leeds. The two of them exchanged Christmas cards until Thompson's death in 1968. The cards are brief. Season's greetings. Hope you are well. The kind of thing you send to an old friend. But Geoffrey Thompson kept every single one. They were in the same box as the letters. 44 years of Christmas cards from a man he had once written love letters to in the trenches of France. When the museum published excerpts from the letters in 2003, Thompson's surviving family was shocked. They had no idea. One of his nephews told a researcher that Geoffrey had always seemed sad somehow, that he had lived alone his entire adult life and never seemed interested in finding a wife. The nephew said, I suppose now I know why. And then he said, I wish he had felt like he could tell us. I wish he had known we would have loved him anyway. That wish comes too late for Jeffrey Thompson. But it matters that someone said it. It matters that the letters survived. It matters that we know his name and Arthur's name, and that they loved each other enough to risk everything. Now let us talk about the men who did not survive, not because they were killed in battle, but because the war ended and they could not figure out how to live in the world that came after. The suicide rate among First World War veterans was staggering. Official numbers are hard to come by because many suicides were not recorded as such. Families lied. Coroners lied. Death certificates said accident or heart failure when everyone knew the truth. But estimates suggest that tens of thousands of British veterans took their own lives in the decades after the armistice. Some because of shell shock. Some because of injuries that left them unable to work. Some because they came home to a country that had no idea what to do with them. And some because they came home to a country where the life they had lived during the war, the love they had found, was illegal, and they could not go back to pretending it had never existed. In 1922, a veteran named William Sharp was found dead in his flat in Manchester. He was 31. He had served with the King's Own Royal Regiment from 1914 to 1918. He had been gassed at Passchendaele, spent 6 months in a hospital, and returned to the front in time for the final German offensive. He survived. He came home. He found work as a clerk, and 4 years later, he swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills and left a note that said, I cannot do this anymore. I am tired of being afraid. The inquest ruled it suicide due to melancholia brought on by war service, which was true, but it was not the whole truth. Because among William Sharp's possessions, the police found a stack of letters from another veteran. The letters were affectionate. They referenced shared memories. They included plans to meet. The police showed the letters to Sharp's landlady. She said she had seen the other man visit the flat several times. She said she had thought it strange that two grown men would spend so much time together. But she had not said anything because they were veterans, and she felt sorry for them. The police filed a report. They did not name the other man. They did not investigate further. Sharp was dead. There was no crime to prosecute. The letters were destroyed. The case was closed. We only know about it because a journalist named Harry Croft was researching veteran suicides in the 1920s and found a reference to the case in a Manchester police archive. He published a brief mention of it in a 2011 book on post-war mental health. He does not speculate about the nature of Sharp's relationship with the unnamed letter writer. He does not need to. The facts speak for themselves. How many other William Sharps were there? Men who survived the war but could not survive the peace. Men who had tasted a kind of freedom and then had it taken away. Men who realized they would spend the rest of their lives pretending to be something they were not, and decided they would rather not live at all. We will never know, because those deaths were not recorded as what they were. They were filed under shell shock, adjustment disorder, failure to cope. The archive is full of euphemisms designed to hide the truth. And the truth is that for some gay soldiers, the end of the war was the beginning of a grief they could not survive. But some men found a way. Not an easy way, not a safe way, but a way. After the war, certain cities became known as places where gay men could live with slightly less fear. Berlin, Paris, London, in specific neighborhoods. These cities had always had gay communities. But the war had changed something. It had sent millions of men to Europe. Some of those men had discovered things about themselves in the trenches. And when the war ended, some of them did not go home. They stayed. They found each other. They built lives in the margins. In Paris, there was a café on the Rue de Lappe called Le Hanneton. It had been there since before the war, but in the 1920s, it became a gathering place for British veterans who had decided to stay in France. Some were artists, some were writers, some were just men who could not face going back to England. The café was known quietly as a place where you could meet other men. where you could have a conversation that did not have to be coded, where you could dance with another man and no one would call the police. Siegfried Sassoon visited Lahanaton in 1923. He wrote about it in his diary. He described it as a place full of ghosts, men who looked like they were still living in the trenches, men who could not let go of the war because the war had been the only time they felt alive. He wrote that he sat in a corner and watched two young men dancing and felt such overwhelming grief that he had to leave. He did not write why, but it is not hard to guess. He was watching men live the life he could not have, the life he had gone home to England and tried to bury under a conventional marriage, and seeing it made him realize what he had given up. That grief is all over his later poetry. The poems he wrote in the 1920s and 1930s are full of loss, not the loss of the war, the loss of something that came after. He writes about being haunted, about walking through life as a kind of ghost, about knowing there was a version of himself he had left behind in France and would never get back. In 1929, an English veteran named Ronald Furbank published a novel called The Flower Beneath the Foot. It is a strange, campy, satirical book about a fictional European kingdom. On the surface, it has nothing to do with the war. But if you read it knowing that Furbank was gay, knowing that he had served briefly in the war before being discharged for health reasons, knowing that he spent the 1920s living openly with other men in Italy and France, the book becomes something else. It becomes a coded meditation on what it means to live in a world that will not let you be yourself. The novel's protagonist is in love with someone he cannot have. He spends the entire book pretending to be content with a life that is slowly killing him. In the final pages, he enters a monastery, not because he has found faith, but because it is the only place he can go where no one will ask him why he is alone. The novel was not widely read. Critics found it too odd, too mannered, too detached from reality. Furbank died in 1926, 3 years before the book was published. He was 40. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but people who knew him said he had been drinking himself to death for years, that he had been desperately unhappy, that he had survived the war only to lose himself in the aftermath. His novel is still in print. Every few decades, someone rediscovers it and realizes what it actually is. A survivor's account, written in code, about a man who could not find a way to live in a world that hated him for being what he was. Not every story from this era is tragic. Some men found ways to build lives. Quiet lives. Hidden lives. But lives. In 1925, two veterans named Thomas Bourne and Henry Fletcher bought a small farm in rural Devon. They had served together in the Devonshire Regiment. They had known each other since 1915. After the war, they both went home to separate towns, tried to settle into civilian life, and realized they could not bear it. So they pooled their savings, bought 30 acres of sheep pasture, and told their families they were going into business together. Two ex-soldiers starting a farm. No one questioned it. They lived on that farm for 43 years. They raised sheep. They sold wool. They kept to themselves. The neighbours thought they were a bit odd but harmless. No one ever asked if they were a couple. No one needed to ask. Everyone knew. And in rural Devon in the 1920s, in a place where everyone had lost someone in the war, people decided to leave them alone. Thomas Bourne died in 1968. Henry Fletcher died 6 months later. The farm was sold. The new owners found, in the attic, a box of letters the two men had written to each other during the war. The letters made it clear they had been planning this life since 1916. That the farm had been a dream they had held onto through 3 years of shelling and gas and mud. That it had kept them alive. The new owners donated the letters to a local historical society in 1985. The society published excerpts in a pamphlet about the war's impact on Devon. The pamphlet described Bourne and Fletcher as close friends and business partners who found solace in each other's company after the trauma of war, which is true. But anyone reading those letters knows they were more than that. They were two men who loved each other and found a way to live together for 4 decades in a country that said their love was a crime. That farm still exists. It is owned by someone else now. But if you drive through Devon and you know the story, you can find it. A small stone house, a barn, 30 acres of green pasture. 2 men lived there. 2 men who survived a war and then survived the peace. And no one ever thanked them for it. But they did not need thanks. They had each other. And in 1925, that was more than most gay men could hope for. Now, let us talk about the men who could not hide. The men who were too visible, too flamboyant, too unable or unwilling to perform straightness convincingly enough to survive. The interwar period in Britain was brutal for effeminate gay men. The ones who could pass, who could act straight, who could disappear into conventional life, had a chance. But the ones who could not were destroyed. They lost jobs. They were evicted from homes. They were arrested on thin pretexts. They were beaten in the street. And the police did nothing because assaulting a queer was not considered a crime worth investigating. In 1927, a veteran named Cyril Ashford was beaten to death outside a pub in Soho. He was 34. He had served with the Royal Fusiliers during the war. He had been wounded at the Somme, received a medal, come home. He worked as a clerk. He lived in a boarding house in Bloomsbury. And he was known, in certain circles, as someone who did not bother to hide. He wore makeup sometimes. He walked with an exaggerated sway. He called other men darling in public. He was, by the standards of 1927, flamboyantly, undeniably, visibly queer. On the night he died, he left a pub in Soho with another man. A group of young men followed them, started shouting. Cyril shouted back. The group surrounded him, beat him, left him in the gutter. He died before an ambulance arrived. The police arrested no one. The inquest ruled it death by misadventure. Cyril Ashford's family did not claim his body. He was buried in a pauper's grave. The only reason we know his name is because a journalist named Geoffrey Morehouse wrote about the case in a 1976 article on violence against gay men in London. Morehouse tracked down the inquest report. He found a witness who remembered the night. The witness said everyone knew why Cyril had been killed, and everyone knew the police did not care. Cyril Ashford had survived 4 years in the trenches. He had survived the Somme. He had survived gas attacks and artillery barrages and trench raids, and he came home to a country that let him be murdered in the street for wearing makeup. That is the reality that most histories of the First World War leave out. They talk about the lost generation, the men who died in France, the men who came home shell-shocked and broken, but they do not talk about the men who came home and were murdered for being gay. The men who survived the war only to be killed by their own countrymen in a London alley because they refused to pretend. And there were many of them. Cyril Ashford was not unique. He was just one of the few whose death was documented. Let us shift focus now to the men who turned their war experience into art. Because some gay soldiers came home and realized the only way to survive was to write it down, to turn the horror and the love and the grief into something that could be shared, even if it had to be shared in code. We have already talked about Wilfred Owen, about Siegfried Sassoon, but they were not the only ones. There were others, less famous, but just as important. A poet named Robert Nichols published a collection called Ardours and Endurances in 1917. The poems are brutal, unflinching descriptions of men dying in the mud, bodies torn apart, screaming. The horror of industrialized war. But woven through the violence is another thread. Poems about the beauty of young soldiers, their faces, their hands, the way they looked when they slept. Nichols writes about watching a boy die and wanting to hold him, about carrying a wounded man back to the trench and feeling something he cannot name. The critics loved the war poetry. They ignored the rest. Nichols was praised for his unflinching realism, for capturing the truth of the trenches. No one mentioned the homoerotic undertones, either because they did not notice or because they chose not to. Nichols knew what he was doing. In a letter to a friend in 1918, he wrote, "I am saying things in these poems that I could never say in life. I am putting my whole self on the page. And if people choose not to see it, that is their failure, not mine. He survived the war. He continued writing. He published more poetry, several plays, novels. None of it sold well. He spent the 1920s struggling financially, drinking too much, sliding into depression. In 1944, he moved to California and spent the last decade of his life teaching literature at UCLA. He never married. He lived alone. He died in 1963. His poems are mostly forgotten now, but they are still in print. And every few years, someone reads them and sees what the critics in 1917 refused to see. Another writer, Beverly Nichols, no relation to Robert, served briefly in the war before being invalided out in 1916. He came home and became a journalist. He wrote dozens of books, memoirs, novels, gardening columns, celebrity profiles. He was enormously successful. He was also flagrantly, obviously gay. He lived with a series of male partners. He threw parties where everyone knew the guest list was entirely queer men. He got away with it because he was charming, because he was wealthy, because he had powerful friends who protected him. But he paid a price. In his 1966 memoir, The Unforgiving Minute, he wrote about the loneliness of living a public life while keeping the most important parts of yourself hidden. He wrote about watching friends get arrested, about being blackmailed, about the constant low-level terror that one day someone would decide he had gone too far and he would lose everything. He wrote, "The war was the freest I ever felt. I was terrified every moment. I was surrounded by death. But I was also surrounded by men. And for the first time in my life, I did not have to explain why that mattered to me." Beverly Nichols died in 1983. He was 84. He had outlived most of his friends. He had outlived the world he had grown up in. And in his final interview, given to a BBC journalist 2 months before his death, he said that if he could go back and change one thing about his life, it would be to have lived openly, to have told the truth, to have named the men he loved instead of hiding them behind euphemisms and coded language. The journalist asked why he had not. Nichols said, "Because I wanted to survive." And survival required silence. That silence is the through line of every gay soldier's story. The men who survived the war came home to a society that required them to stay quiet, to not name what they had experienced, to frame their love as camaraderie, their grief as shell shock, their longing as nostalgia for a simpler time. And most of them did stay quiet, because the alternative was prison or violence or social death. But their silence does not mean they did not exist. It does not mean their love was not real. It just means we have to work harder to hear them. The archive does give us clues, small ones, fragments that survived because someone decided not to burn a letter, because a diary stayed hidden in an attic for 70 years, because a photograph was tucked into a book and forgotten. There is a photograph in the National Army Museum that has puzzled researchers for decades. It shows 2 soldiers sitting on the steps of a ruined building somewhere in France. The back of the photograph is stamped with a date, September 1916. No location, no names, just 2 men in British uniforms, sitting close enough that their shoulders touch. One of them has his hand resting on the other's knee. It is a casual gesture, the kind of thing you might do without thinking if you were sitting with someone you were comfortable with, someone you trusted. Except that in every other photograph from the First World War, soldiers are careful about how they position themselves. They stand at attention. They keep space between each other. Physical contact is minimal, formal. A hand on a shoulder maybe, but always posed, always aware of the camera. These 2 men are not posing. They are leaning into each other. The one with his hand on the other's knee is looking at the camera, but his companion is looking down at something out of frame. His expression is soft, unguarded. It is the kind of look you give someone when you are not thinking about who might be watching. The museum has no idea who they were. The photograph was donated in 1972 by a woman who said she found it in a box of her father's things after he died. Her father had served in the war, but never talked about it. She did not recognize the men in the photograph. She assumed they were her father's friends. She donated the entire box to the museum because she thought it might be useful for researchers. For 40 years, the photograph sat in the archive. Researchers used it occasionally as a generic image of soldiers at rest. No one paid much attention to the hand on the knee, or if they did, they assumed it was just the casual intimacy of men at war, the kind of thing that happens when you live in close quarters and the normal rules of physical distance do not apply. Then in 2014, a historian named Helen Smith was going through the collection for a project on trench photography. She saw the photograph, and she stopped, because she had spent years looking at pictures of soldiers from the First World War, and she had never seen one quite like this. She started investigating. She tried to identify the men. She analysed their uniforms, their insignia, the architecture of the ruined building behind them. She narrowed it down to a specific regiment, a specific sector of the front, a specific 2-week period in September 1916. But she could not find their names. There were too many men, too many possible matches. What she did find, in the same donated box, was a letter, tucked into an envelope with no address. The letter was dated October 1916. It was written in pencil, on paper so thin it had nearly disintegrated. The handwriting was cramped, difficult to read, but the first line was clear enough. "My darling, I am writing this in the hope that you will never have to read it." The letter goes on for 3 pages. The writer describes being in a field hospital. He has been wounded. He does not specify how. He writes about pain, about infection, about the doctors telling him he will probably survive, but it will take time. And then he writes about the person the letter is addressed to. He does not name them. He refers to them only as you. He writes, "I keep thinking about the afternoon we spent in the farmhouse. Do you remember? The one with the broken roof and the shattered staircase. We were supposed to be checking for snipers. Instead, we sat on the floor, and you told me about the bookshop you wanted to open after the war. You said you would name it after your mother. You said I could work there if I wanted. I said I wanted nothing more." The letter continues. The writer describes lying in the hospital bed and imagining that future. The bookshop, the two of them working side by side, a life where they did not have to hide. He writes, "I know it is a fantasy. I know the world will never let us have that. But lying here, I let myself pretend. Just for a moment." The letter ends abruptly. The final sentence is, "If you are reading this, it means I did not make it. I need you to know that loving you was the only truly good thing I did in this war." Helen Smith had the letter analysed. The paper matched the period. The handwriting matched other samples from 1916. But there was no signature, no way to identify the writer or the recipient. All she had was the photograph and the letter, found in the same box, donated by the same woman. Smith published an article about the find in 2015. She argued that the photograph showed the 2 men referenced in the letter, that the hand on the knee, the unguarded expressions, the intimacy of the pose, all suggested a relationship that went beyond friendship, that the letter was proof that some soldiers were not just living alongside each other, but loving each other, in the full, undeniable, romantic sense of the word. Other historians disagreed. They said the evidence was circumstantial, that men in the war often wrote emotionally intense letters to their friends, that the photograph could be explained by the breakdown of normal social boundaries under combat conditions, that assuming a sexual or romantic relationship was reading too much into limited evidence. But Smith stood by her interpretation. She pointed out that the letter writer used the word loving, not friendship, not camaraderie, loving. She pointed out that the writer explicitly said they could never have a future together, which made no sense if this was just a friendship. Friends could have a future together. Friends could open a bookshop. The only reason they could not was if the relationship was something society would not tolerate. The debate continues. The photograph and the letter are still in the museum. You can request to see them if you visit. And every year, a few people do. Most of them are researchers. But some are just visitors who heard the story and wanted to see the evidence for themselves, wanted to look at the photograph and imagine, just for a moment, that those two men had the future they dreamed about, the bookshop, the life together, the world that let them love each other openly. They did not get that future. We know that much. The letter was never sent, which means either the writer died or he recovered and decided it was too dangerous to send. Either way, the letter stayed hidden, and the men in the photograph stayed anonymous. Just two soldiers sitting on the steps of a ruined building in France, holding on to each other for a moment before the war pulled them apart. Now let us talk about the soldiers who were even more invisible than the ones we have been discussing. The men who were erased, not just because they were gay, but because they were working class, because they were colonized subjects, because they occupied positions in society that meant no one bothered to record their names. The British Army in the First World War was not just British. It included soldiers from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from every corner of the empire. Millions of men who were recruited or conscripted or who volunteered because they believed fighting for Britain might earn them some measure of equality, some measure of recognition. Some of those men were gay. We know this because queerness is not a Western invention. It has existed in every culture, in every era, in every corner of the world. But the archive of gay soldiers from colonized nations is almost non-existent, because the men who compiled that archive, the British officers who wrote the reports and kept the records, did not consider those soldiers worth documenting in detail. They were labor. They were cannon fodder. Their personal lives were irrelevant, but fragments survive, small pieces. Enough to know that the story of gay soldiers in the First World War is not just a story about white British men. The historian Santanu Das found a court-martial record from 1917 involving two Indian soldiers in the 9th Bhopal Infantry. The men were accused of committing an unnatural act while stationed at a camp in Mesopotamia. The record is brief. It does not name the soldiers. It does not describe what they were accused of doing. It simply notes that they were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 6 months hard labor. They were sent to a military prison in India. There is no record of what happened to them after that. Das spent years trying to find more information. He searched through regimental records, pension files, anything that might give him their names. He found nothing. The two men had been erased, reduced to a case number in a ledger that almost no one would ever read. But they existed. They were real. They were Indian soldiers who loved each other or desired each other or simply sought comfort with each other in the middle of a war they had been forced to fight. And they were punished for it. And then they were forgotten. How many others were there? Men from the colonies who found each other in the trenches, in the camps, in the hospitals. Men who had no letters preserved, no diaries kept, no photographs taken. Men whose names were never written down because the empire did not consider them worth remembering. We will never know their stories, but we can acknowledge that they existed, that the history of gay soldiers in the First World War is not just the history of British poets and upper-class officers. It is also the history of men whose names we will never know. Men who were erased twice, once because they were gay, and once because they were colonized. Let us return now to the question of what it actually felt like to be a gay soldier in the trenches. because we have talked about the relationships, the letters, the court-martials. But we have not talked enough about the day-to-day reality, the texture of that life. Imagine you are a 22-year-old man in 1916. You grew up in a world where you learned very early that there was something different about you, that you did not want the things other boys wanted, that when you looked at another boy, you felt something you were not supposed to feel, and you learned, just as early, that you could never say that out loud. So you learned to hide. You learned to perform. You learned to talk about girls the way your friends did, even though you felt nothing. You learned to avoid certain glances, certain gestures, certain tones of voice that might give you away. You learned that survival meant pretending to be someone you were not. And then the war started. And you enlisted because everyone else was enlisting, because staying home meant questions you could not answer, because the idea of spending 4 more years in your small town, where everyone knew, everyone felt unbearable. And suddenly you are in a trench in France. You are surrounded by men. You sleep next to them. You wash next to them. You see them undress, see them shave, see them in states of exhaustion and fear and vulnerability that you have never seen before. And you realize, with a mixture of terror and relief, that you are surrounded by the very thing you have spent your entire life trying not to look at too closely. At first, it is torture, because you are trying so hard not to stare, not to let your gaze linger, not to let anyone notice. You are more careful than you have ever been, because the consequences of being caught are worse here than they ever were at home. At home, you might lose your job. Here, you could be court-martialed, imprisoned, shot. But then, something shifts, because you start to realize that everyone is too tired, too scared, too focused on survival to notice the small things. You start to realize that you can look, just a little, just enough, and no one sees. Or if they see, they do not care. And then you start to notice other men looking, the same way you are looking, and you start to wonder. And maybe, if you are very lucky, you find someone who looks back, someone who understands. It starts with small things, sitting closer than necessary, letting a hand brush against a hand, holding a gaze for a second longer than you should, testing, seeing if the other person pulls away, seeing if they move closer, and if they move closer, then maybe one night, in a dugout where everyone else is asleep, you whisper something, or they whisper something, and you realize you are not alone, that the person you have been watching has been watching you too. And maybe that is all it ever becomes. Whispers in the dark, stolen moments, the knowledge that someone sees you and does not look away. For some men, that is enough. It is more than they ever had before. For others, it becomes more. A relationship, hidden, constantly at risk, but real. The historian Emma Vickers interviewed several gay men in the 1990s who had served in the Second World War. The men were in their 70s and 80s by then, and many of them said the same thing, that the war was the first time they felt free. Not because the war was safe, but because the war gave them access to other men in a way civilian life never did. And some of them found love, or something close to it. And even though they could never name it, even though they had to hide it, it was the most important thing that ever happened to them. The First World War was no different. The men who fought in it did not have the language we have now. They did not call themselves gay. That word, in the sense we use it today, did not exist yet. Some of them might have thought of themselves as inverts, a medical term from the period. Some might have thought of themselves as simply men who loved other men. Some might not have had any language for it at all, but they knew what they felt. They knew it was real, and they knew it was dangerous. Philip Bainbrig, whose diary we discussed earlier, wrote about this tension constantly. He wrote about the fear, the need to be vigilant, the exhaustion of maintaining a performance every waking moment. But he also wrote about the joy, the overwhelming, unexpected joy of being seen by someone who understood. In one entry from 1917, he writes about sitting with Kay, the signaller he loved, in a shell crater. They are supposed to be looking for enemy movement. Instead, they are talking. And Kay says something. Bainbrig does not record what, and Bainbrig realizes that Kay knows. That Kay has known for weeks. That all the careful pretending has been pointless because Kay saw through it from the beginning. Bainbrig writes, "I thought I would be terrified. I thought I would panic. Instead, I felt lighter than I have felt in years, because I did not have to pretend anymore, not with him." They spent 3 more months together before Kay was transferred. Bainbrig writes that those 3 months were the happiest of his life, not in spite of the war, not even because of the intensity of wartime emotions, but because he was with someone who knew him, all of him, and did not turn away. That is what gay soldiers in the First World War were looking for, not just sex, not just physical intimacy, though some found that too, but recognition, the experience of being seen by another person and not being rejected, of being known and not being destroyed. For most of human history, gay people have lived without that. They have lived in isolation. They have believed they were the only ones. They have spent their entire lives hiding, pretending, performing. And then, occasionally, they meet someone who makes them realize they are not alone, that there are others, that what they feel is not a sickness or a sin, but simply a fact of who they are. For the soldiers in the trenches, that realization could happen in the middle of the worst circumstances imaginable, surrounded by death, surrounded by mud and blood and the constant threat of annihilation. And yet, in the middle of all that, 2 men could find each other, could sit in a shell crater and realize they were the same. And for a few moments, the war would fade into the background, and all that would matter was the person sitting next to them. The poet Ivor Gurney, who served with the Gloucestershire Regiment, wrote about this in a poem called The Companion. The poem describes 2 soldiers walking together through a ruined landscape. They do not speak, but they walk in step, and the narrator writes that he feels more understood in that silence than he has ever felt in any conversation. Gurney was gay. He never said so explicitly. But his biographers have pieced it together from his letters, his poetry, his life. He never had a romantic relationship with a woman. He wrote constantly about the beauty of young men. And after the war, he spent the last 15 years of his life in a mental asylum, writing poetry that no one would publish until after his death. His poem The Companion is not overtly about desire, but it is about connection, about finding someone who walks beside you, who understands without needing words. And for Gurney, that was enough. That was everything. He died in 1937. He was 47. Most of his poetry was not published until the 1950s. By then, he had been forgotten. Another name on a long list of war poets who did not survive the aftermath. But his work endures, and every few years, someone reads The Companion and realizes what it is actually about, and realizes that Ivor Gurney, like so many others, was writing in code, saying the things he could not say directly, hoping that someday someone would understand. Let us talk now about the men who were caught, the ones who took the risk and lost, because their stories matter too. They are the ones who paid the price for everyone else's silence. The court-martial records are brutal to read. They are clinical, detached. They reduce love to a list of charges. They reduce human beings to defendants and witnesses and evidence. But if you read between the lines, you can see the fear, the desperation, the pleading. In April 1918, a private named George Coleman was court-martialed for gross indecency with another soldier. The trial took place in a tent behind the lines in France. It lasted 3 hours. Coleman was accused of being found in a compromising position with a lance corporal named David Harris. Both men were in their early 20s. Both had served since 1915. Both had clean records. The evidence against them was testimony from a sergeant who claimed he had entered a storage dugout and found the two men partially undressed. The sergeant reported it to his commanding officer. The officer ordered an investigation. Coleman and Harris were questioned separately. Coleman denied everything. Harris admitted to what the sergeant had seen, but claimed it was not what it looked like. He said they had been changing clothes, that the dugout was the only place with enough privacy to do so without being seen by the entire company. The court did not believe him. Both men were found guilty. Coleman was sentenced to 2 years hard labour. Harris was sentenced to 18 months. Both were discharged from the army with ignominy. Both were sent to military prisons in England. The trial record includes a transcript of Coleman's final statement. He stood in front of the court and said, "I have served my country for 3 years. I have fought in every major battle since 1915. I have been wounded twice. I have been commended for bravery. And now you are telling me that I am a criminal because of who I am. I do not accept that. I will never accept that." The court was unmoved. The sentence stood. George Coleman was released from prison in 1920. He tried to find work. No one would hire him. His discharge papers listed the reason for his dismissal. Everyone who saw them knew what it meant. He ended up working as a day labourer, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for people to start asking questions. In Wascopically 1927, he was arrested again, this time for soliciting another man in a public park in Birmingham. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to another year in prison. When he was released in 1928, he disappeared. There is no record of what happened to him after that. David Harris fared slightly better. He served his sentence and was released in 1919. He moved to Canada, changed his name, started over. He lived quietly. He never married. He worked as a carpenter. He died in 1962. His obituary in a Toronto newspaper described him as a veteran of the First World War who had served with distinction. It did not mention the court-martial. It did not mention the prison sentence. It did not mention George Coleman. But Harris had kept something. Among his possessions, found after his death, was a single photograph. It showed 2 young soldiers standing outside a tent. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written George and David, France, 1917. Harris never spoke about George Coleman, not to anyone. But he kept that photograph for 43 years, carried it with him across an ocean, carried it through a new life, a new name, a new country, where no one knew what had happened to him. And when he died, the photograph was still there, tucked into a book, waiting to be found. That photograph is in a private collection now. Harris's nephew donated it to the Canadian War Museum in 1985. The museum catalogued it as a general image of soldiers in France. They had no idea who George and David were, no idea that the 2 men standing in that photograph had been court-martialed, imprisoned, separated. No idea that one of them had kept the photograph for the rest of his life as the only proof that what they had was real. This is what court-martial meant for gay soldiers. Not just punishment, erasure, the destruction of any future you might have built, the knowledge that you would spend the rest of your life marked, that everywhere you went, someone would know, that you would never be safe again. And yet men still took the risk. They still found each other. They still loved each other. Because the alternative, a life of complete isolation, of never being seen, of never being known, was worse than the risk of being caught. Now let us talk about the question everyone wants answered, but no one wants to ask. How common was this? How many gay soldiers were there in the trenches of the First World War? We do not have numbers. We will never have numbers. Sexuality was not something anyone tracked. There were no surveys, no studies, no official acknowledgement that gay soldiers even existed. What we have instead are estimates, extrapolations, educated guesses based on fragments of evidence. Modern research suggests that roughly 5 to 10% of any population is gay or bisexual. If we apply that percentage to the British Army during the First World War, which fielded approximately 5 million men, that gives us somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 gay or bisexual soldiers, a quarter to 500,000 men. That is a staggering number, and it is almost certainly an underestimate, because those percentages are based on populations where people feel safe enough to identify themselves. In a society where being gay was illegal, where the consequences of being caught were prison or worse, many men would have hidden so deeply that they might not have even admitted the truth to themselves. So the real number could be higher, could be much higher. We will never know. What we do know is that gay soldiers were not a tiny minority. They were not a handful of isolated cases. They were everywhere, in every regiment, in every trench, in every hospital, enough that if you were gay and you were looking, you could find someone else. Eventually, if you were careful, if you were lucky. The historian Matt Holbrook has argued that the First World War was a turning point for gay men in Britain. Not because the war itself was more tolerant, but because the war brought men together in unprecedented numbers. It created a situation where gay men could meet each other in ways that civilian life made almost impossible. And once they had met, once they knew there were others, they could not go back to believing they were alone. After the war, cities like London and Paris saw the beginnings of visible gay communities, clubs, bars, meeting places. These had existed before, in small hidden pockets. But after the war, they grew, because the men who came back had seen something. They had lived for a few years in a world where they were surrounded by other men, where physical closeness was expected, where affection between men was normalized, and they wanted that again. The war did not make those men gay, but it showed them that a different kind of life was possible, that they did not have to live in complete isolation. And some of them decided to build that life. Consequences be damned. But most did not. Most went home, got married, had children, lived the lives they were supposed to live, and buried what they had felt during the war so deeply that no one would ever find it. Except that sometimes, late at night, they would take out a letter, or a photograph, or a small object, a button, a cigarette case, a pocket knife, something that had belonged to another soldier, and they would hold it, and remember, and grieve for the person they had been allowed to be for a few brief years before the world closed in again. There is a poem by Siegfried Sassoon, written in 1945, nearly 30 years after the war. It is called Everyone Sang. The poem describes a moment of sudden, overwhelming joy, a feeling of release, of freedom, of being part of something larger than yourself. The poem does not mention the war explicitly, but everyone who reads it knows what it is about. It is about the moment the war ended, the moment the guns stopped, the moment everyone realized they had survived. But for Sassoon, that moment was not about survival, it was about loss. Because the end of the war meant going home, meant leaving behind the men he had lived with, fought with, loved, meant returning to a society that would never let him be the person he had been in the trenches. The poem ends with the image of birds flying free, released from a cage, and the narrator standing alone, watching them go. It is a beautiful image, and it is unbearably sad, because Sassoon knew he would never be free, that the cage was waiting for him, that the rest of his life would be spent pretending the war had not changed him, pretending he had not loved the men he had loved. He lived another 22 years after writing that poem. He died in 1967, and to the very end, he was writing about the war, about the men he had known, about the life he had lived for 4 years and then lost. The war poets are the ones we remember: Sassoon, Owen, Gurney, Nichols, because they left behind words, because their poetry survived. But for every poet who wrote about what he felt, there were 1,000 men who had no words, who did not know how to name what they had experienced, who simply lived with it, carried it, let it shape the rest of their lives in ways they could never explain. Now let us talk about the physical reality of intimacy in the trenches, because we have talked about love, about letters, about emotional connection, but we have not talked much about bodies, about the actual physical conditions that made any kind of intimacy almost impossible. The trenches were filthy. Imagine living in a ditch filled with mud that comes up to your knees, water that never drains, rats the size of cats, lice that burrow into every piece of clothing you own. You have not bathed in weeks. You smell like rot and cordite and human waste. Your uniform is stiff with dried mud and blood. Your skin is covered in sores from the lice bites. Your feet are rotting inside your boots from standing in water for days at a time. This is not an environment conducive to romance. This is barely an environment conducive to survival. And yet, men still found ways, because human beings are astonishingly stubborn about finding connection, even in the worst circumstances. Privacy was the main obstacle. There was none. You lived shoulder to shoulder with 30 other men. You slept in a dugout carved into the side of the trench wall, and that dugout was maybe 6 feet wide and held 4 to 6 men at a time. You ate together. You defecated in a latrine that was a wooden plank stretched over a pit 10 feet from where you slept. You washed, when you washed, in a bucket of cold water that 10 other men had already used. If you wanted to be alone with another person, you had to get creative. You had to wait for a moment when everyone else was occupied, when there was a work detail, when someone was sent to fetch supplies, when the rest of the men were sleeping. Those moments were rare, and they were brief. Some men found ruined buildings, farmhouses that had been shelled into rubble but still had a cellar, a back room, a corner hidden from view, supply dugouts, communication trenches that ran behind the main line and were empty during certain hours. Anywhere you could steal 10 minutes without being seen. The risk was enormous. If you were caught, if someone walked in, if a superior officer came looking for you, your life was over. Court-martial, discharge, prison, social death. And yet men still took that risk, which tells you how desperately they needed those 10 minutes. How much it mattered to touch another person, to be touched in return. The court-martial records give us glimpses of this. They describe men found in storage dugouts, in abandoned farmhouses, in communication trenches. The records are always vague about what exactly the men were doing, partly because the courts did not want the details in an official document, partly because the witnesses, the sergeants and officers who stumbled upon these scenes, did not want to describe what they had seen. But occasionally, the records are more specific. In one case from 1917, 2 soldiers were found in a cellar behind the lines. The arresting officer described them as lying together in a state of undress. The soldiers claimed they had been resting, that they had taken off their wet uniforms to let them dry, that there was nothing improper happening. The court did not believe them. Both men were convicted. Both were sentenced to hard labor. Both were discharged. But the detail that stays with you is the officer's description of the cellar. He wrote that it was cold, dark, damp, that there was no light except what came through a shell hole in the ceiling, that the floor was dirt and rubble, that it smelled like decay. And yet, 2 men chose that place, that cold, dark, damp cellar that smelled like death, because it was the only place they could be alone, the only place they could touch each other without the entire army watching. That is what intimacy looked like in the trenches, not romance, not soft lighting and clean sheets, a dirt floor and 10 stolen minutes and the constant terror of being caught. And for some men, that was enough. It was more than they had ever had before. Let us talk now about the letters again, because letters were the primary way gay soldiers maintained relationships. And the language they used in those letters is fascinating, because it had to do 2 things at once. It had to express genuine emotion, and it had to be deniable. The Edwardian era gave gay men an enormous advantage in this regard, because the culture of male friendship at the time allowed for language that, to a modern reader, sounds unmistakably romantic. Men could write to each other using terms of endearment. My dear, my dearest, beloved. They could describe missing each other, longing to see each other, thinking of each other constantly. And as long as there was no explicit reference to physical intimacy, the letters were considered acceptable. This meant that a gay soldier could write a love letter to another man, and if the letter was intercepted, if it was read by a censor or a superior officer, it could be dismissed as just the heightened emotion of wartime friendship. The plausible deniability was built into the language itself. But the soldiers writing those letters knew what they meant, and the soldiers receiving them knew what they meant. The code was transparent to anyone who was looking for it. Robert Graves received a letter from Siegfried Sassoon in 1917 that included the line, "You are the only person I trust completely, the only person I can be honest with." Graves, in his memoir, Goodbye to All That, describes this as evidence of their deep friendship. He frames it as the kind of bond that forms between men in combat, which it was, but it was also more than that. Sassoon was in love with Graves, and Graves either did not realize or chose not to realize. The letters between Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon are even more revealing. Owen wrote to Sassoon constantly after they met in 1917. The letters are full of admiration, yes. Owen revered Sassoon as a poet, but they are also full of longing. Owen describes counting the days until they can meet again. He describes dreams he has had about Sassoon. He describes reading Sassoon's letters multiple times, memorizing them. Sassoon's letters to Owen are more restrained, but they are warm, encouraging, affectionate. He calls Owen by pet names. He tells Owen he thinks about him often. He sends him books, poems, advice. Were they lovers? The evidence suggests not. But Owen wanted them to be, and Sassoon knew, and chose to keep the relationship in a space where it could be affectionate without crossing a line that would make it dangerous. That restraint, that careful navigation of boundaries, is all through the letters of gay soldiers. They are full of desire, but the desire is always coded, always hidden beneath a layer of acceptable friendship. And you can feel the tension in every line, the wanting, the fear, the knowledge that saying too much could destroy everything. Some soldiers were less careful. Philip Bainbrig, in his coded diary, wrote openly about what he felt. But the diary was private. It was written in cipher. He never intended anyone to read it. The letters that were sent, the ones that travelled through the military postal system, had to be more cautious. Because letters were censored, officers read them, and if a letter contained anything that suggested improper conduct, the sender could be investigated. So soldiers learned to write in metaphor. They learned to say, "I miss you," when they meant "I love you." They learned to describe a landscape, a sunset, a piece of music, and embed their actual meaning in the description. The reader, on the other end, if they knew the code, could decode it. Everyone else would see only a sentimental letter about the beauty of France. This kind of coded communication required trust. You had to trust that the person you were writing to would understand, that they would read between the lines, that they would not misinterpret, or worse, show the letter to someone else. And sometimes that trust was misplaced. Sometimes a letter was shown to the wrong person. Sometimes a recipient panicked and destroyed the letter, or reported the sender, or simply stopped writing back. The risk was always there. But thousands of men took that risk anyway, because the letters were the only way to maintain a connection, the only way to say the things they could not say in person, the only proof that what they felt was real. Now let us talk about what happened to the letters after the war, because most of them were destroyed, either by the men who wrote them, or by the men who received them, or by the families who found them after someone died. Saving a love letter from another man was dangerous. If the letter was ever found, if someone read it and understood what it meant, the consequences could be devastating. So most men burned their letters, tore them up, buried them, made sure no trace remained. But some letters survived, because some men could not bring themselves to destroy the only proof that they had been loved. And so they hid them, in attics, in trunks, in the backs of drawers, and sometimes, decades later, someone found them. The letters between Jeffrey Thompson and Arthur Glynn survived because Thompson kept them in a locked box in his attic, and no one opened that box until after he died. The letter found with the photograph of the two soldiers sitting on the steps survived because it was tucked into an envelope and forgotten. Philip Bainbrig's diary survived because he encoded it and his nephew did not realize what it was. These survivals are accidents. For every letter that survived, hundreds were destroyed. For every diary that was preserved, dozens were burned. The archive of gay soldiers in the First World War is a tiny fraction of what once existed. Most of it is gone, lost forever. And that loss is deliberate. It is the result of a century of people deciding that these stories were too dangerous to keep, too shameful, too damaging to reputations, to families, to the memory of men who were supposed to be heroes. But the letters that did survive are enough to show us what was lost. They are enough to prove that gay soldiers existed, that they loved, that they mattered, and that they deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes, not as scandals, but as men who lived and loved and fought and died just like everyone else. Let us talk now about the language that did not exist, because one of the hardest things about being a gay soldier in the First World War was that there were no words for what you were. Not words you could say out loud, not words that felt true. The term homosexual existed. It had been coined in the 1860s. But it was a medical term, a clinical diagnosis. It described you as if you were sick, as if what you felt was a disorder that needed to be cured. The term invert was more common. It came from the work of sexologists like Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing. The theory was that gay men were men with female souls trapped in male bodies, that your desire for other men was the result of some biological error, some inversion of what should have been. Neither of these terms felt right to the men who lived with this reality. They did not feel sick. They did not feel like women. They felt like men who loved other men. But there was no language for that, no way to describe it that did not pathologize it. So most men did not use any term at all. They simply lived and loved and hoped that they would not be caught. Some men did try to create a language, a private vocabulary that only other gay men would understand. In London, in the underground gay world that existed in certain pubs and clubs and parks, there were code words, ways to signal to another man that you were like him, ways to ask, without asking directly, if he was interested. But those code words did not travel well. They were specific to a city, a neighbourhood, a particular social circle. If you were a soldier from a small town in Yorkshire, shipped off to France, you would not know the codes. You would not know the signals. You would have to figure it out on your own. And figuring it out meant risk. It meant watching, waiting, testing, seeing if another man held your gaze a second too long, seeing if he found excuses to be near you, seeing if he responded when you said something that could be interpreted two ways. It was exhausting and terrifying, because if you misread the signals, if you approached the wrong person, you could be reported, court-martialed, destroyed. But men did it anyway, because the alternative was spending the entire war alone, never being seen, never being known. And that was worse than the risk. The poet Edward Carpenter, who was openly gay and lived with his male partner in Derbyshire, tried to create a positive language for same-sex love. He wrote essays. He published books. He argued that love between men was not a sickness, but a natural variation of human experience. He used the term Uranian, borrowed from Plato, to describe men who loved men. Carpenter's work was read by some gay soldiers. Siegfried Sassoon read him. So did E.M. Forster, who worked with the Red Cross during the war. Carpenter gave them a framework, a way to think about themselves that was not rooted in shame. But most soldiers never encountered Carpenter's work. They lived and died without ever reading a single positive word about what they were. All they had was the medical language that called them sick, the legal language that called them criminals, and the silence of everyone around them. That silence is what shaped the lives of gay soldiers more than anything else. Not the battles, not the mud, not the fear of death, the silence. The knowledge that you could never speak the truth about who you were, that you would spend your entire life translating your feelings into acceptable language, turning love into friendship, turning longing into nostalgia, turning grief into something the world could tolerate. And that silence continued long after the war ended. The men who survived went home and kept their mouths shut. They married women they did not love. They had children. They built lives that looked from the outside completely normal, and inside they carried the memory of the men they had loved in France, the men they had held in shell craters, the men they had written letters to, the men who had died in their arms. Some of them managed to find each other again after the war. We have talked about the ones who bought farms together, who took rooms near each other, who invented excuses to stay in each other's lives. But those were the lucky ones. Most men lost touch. The war scattered them, sent them back to different towns, different countries, different lives. And they had no way to find each other again, no way to reach out without risking exposure. Imagine that. Imagine loving someone. Imagine going through hell with them. Imagine believing that they were the most important person in your life. And then imagine never seeing them again, never hearing from them, never knowing if they survived the peace the way they survived the war, and never being able to ask, because asking would reveal too much. That is what happened to most gay soldiers. They went home, and they spent the rest of their lives wondering if the person they loved ever thought about them, wondering if they were still alive, wondering if, in some parallel world, they could have had a life together. Philip Bainbrig wondered about Kay for the rest of his life. His diary entries after the war are full of questions. What happened to Kay? Where did he go? Did he survive? Did he think of me the way I think of him? Bainbrig tried to find out. He wrote letters to the War Office asking for information about soldiers who had served in Kay's unit. The responses were bureaucratic, unhelpful. He never found an answer. In 1947, 30 years after Kay was transferred, Bainbrig wrote a diary entry that said, "I dreamed about him again last night. I dream about him less often now. Every year the dreams become rarer. And I am terrified that one day I will stop dreaming about him entirely, that I will forget his face, that the only proof he existed will disappear with me." Bainbrig died in 1953. He never found Kay. He never knew what happened to him. All he had were the memories, the encoded diary entries, the knowledge that for 4 months in 1916 he had been loved by someone who saw him completely. Now let us talk about the ones who did not stay silent, the ones who could not, the ones who survived the war and decided, against all odds, to live openly, to refuse the closet, to build lives that were honest, even if honesty meant losing everything. One of those men was J.R. Ackerley. He served in the war. He was captured by the Germans in 1917 and spent the rest of the conflict in a prisoner of war camp. He came home in 1919, and instead of going back to the life he was supposed to live, he moved to London and became part of the emerging gay literary scene. He worked as a writer, an editor, a cultural critic. He lived openly with male partners. He wrote about his life with a frankness that was almost unheard of at the time. His memoir, My Father and Myself, published in 1968, is one of the most honest accounts of gay life in the early 20th century that exists. Ackley wrote about the war, about the men he met, about the confusion he felt, about realizing slowly that what he felt for other men was not something that would go away, that it was not a phase, that it was who he was. He also wrote about the cost of living openly, about being excluded from certain jobs, about being tolerated but never fully accepted, about the loneliness of being visible in a world that preferred you invisible. But he also wrote about the freedom, the relief of not having to pretend, the joy of being able to say, out loud, that he loved men, that he had no interest in women, that he was not ashamed. Ackley lived until 1967. He saw the world change, slowly, around him. He saw the first tentative steps toward decriminalization. He saw younger gay men start to organize, to demand rights, to refuse to hide. And he wrote that watching that happen felt like vindication, like proof that the silence he had refused to accept had been worth refusing. But most men did not have Ackley's courage. Or maybe they did not have his privilege. Ackley had money. He had connections. He had a career that gave him independence. Most gay soldiers had none of those things. They went home to working-class jobs, to small towns, to families who would have disowned them if they had known the truth. And so, they stayed silent. And they suffered. And they died without ever being able to name what they had lost. Let us talk now about what the war meant for gay men as a community. Because the First World War did something that had never happened before. It brought hundreds of thousands of gay men together. It put them in close proximity. It let them see that they were not alone. And even though most of them went back to hiding after the war, even though most of them never spoke about what they had experienced, the knowledge stayed with them. The knowledge that there were others, that they were part of something larger. That knowledge became the foundation for the gay rights movements that would emerge decades later. The men who fought in the First World War did not live to see marriage equality. They did not live to see pride parades. They did not live to see a world where being gay was no longer a crime. But their survival, their refusal to disappear entirely, their insistence on loving each other even when the world said they should not, created a lineage, a history, a proof that gay people had always existed, that they had always loved, that they had always been part of the story, even when the story tried to erase them. The historian George Chauncey has written about this. He argues that the world wars were turning points for gay communities in the West. Not because the wars themselves were tolerant, but because the wars disrupted the normal social structures that kept gay people isolated. They brought people together. They created opportunities for connection that did not exist in peacetime. And once those connections were made, they could not be unmade. The men who came home from the First World War carried those connections with them. Some of them found each other in the cities. Some of them created networks, quiet, hidden networks of men who knew each other, who trusted each other, who helped each other survive. Those networks were fragile. They were constantly at risk. But they existed, and they were the beginning of something. By the 1960s, those networks had grown into movements that demanded rights, that demanded visibility, that demanded an end to the silence that had governed gay lives for centuries. And the men who built those movements were, in many cases, the sons and grandsons of the soldiers who had fought in the First World War. They inherited the silence, and they decided to break it. But the soldiers themselves, the ones who had lived through the trenches, mostly did not live to see that. Most of them died in the 1950s and 1960s, still hiding, still silent, still carrying secrets they could never tell. They died alone, or surrounded by families who loved them but did not know them, and their stories died with them, except for the fragments, the letters that survived, the diaries, the photographs, the court-martial records, the tiny pieces of evidence that remained because someone, somewhere, decided not to destroy them. Those fragments are all we have, but they are enough. They are enough to know that gay soldiers existed, that they loved each other, that they suffered, that they survived, that they mattered. And they are enough to know that the history we were taught, the history that said the war was fought by straight men, by heroes who went home to wives and children, is incomplete. That the real history is more complicated, more human, more true. Let us end where we began. With Edward Brittain and Victor Richardson, two young men who met at Oxford, who spent a summer hiking in the Lake District, who enlisted on the same day in August 1914, who wrote letters to each other that do not survive, who loved each other in a way they could never name. Victor died in 1915. Edward survived until 1918, and in the years between, Edward carried Victor with him. He carried him through the trenches, through the bombardments, through the gas attacks, through the nights when he thought he would not see morning. Victor was the reason Edward kept going, the memory of him, the love Edward felt for him. When Edward was killed in 1918, the letter found in his pocket was addressed to Victor's mother. It said, "I have tried to live in a way that would make him proud. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I have tried." Edward Brittain was 25 when he died. Victor Richardson was 22. They never had the future they might have wanted. They never had the bookshop. They never had the life together. They had a summer in the Lake District. They had letters. They had 3 years of hoping the war would end and they would see each other again. And then Victor died, and Edward spent the rest of his short life grieving. Vera Brittain wrote about her brother for the rest of her life. She wrote about his grief, his silence, his sense that something essential had been taken from him. She never said directly that Edward had loved Victor, but she came as close as anyone in 1933 could. And because she wrote it down, because she preserved it, we know. We know that Edward Brittain was gay. We know that he loved Victor Richardson. We know that he died grieving. And we know that his story is not unique, that there were thousands of Edwards, thousands of Victors, thousands of men who loved each other and lost each other and spent the rest of their lives carrying that loss. The First World War killed 9 million soldiers. How many of them were gay? How many of them died loving someone they could never name? How many of them went into battle thinking about another man's face? How many of them died holding a letter or a photograph or a small token that reminded them of someone they would never see again? We will never know the numbers, but we know it happened. We know that gay soldiers fought and died and loved and grieved and came home and lived the rest of their lives in silence. And we know that silence was a kind of violence, a violence that continued long after the war ended, a violence that told gay soldiers their love did not matter, that their grief was not real, that their lives could be honoured only if the truth about them was hidden. But the truth does matter. It matters that we say their names. It matters that we acknowledge what they lost. It matters that we refuse to let them be forgotten. Edward Brittain loved Victor Richardson. Philip Bainbrig loved a signaller named K. Jeffrey Thompson, loved Arthur Glynn. Stephen Hewitt loved James Beaumont. George Coleman loved David Harris. Wilfred Owen loved Siegfried Sassoon. And thousands of other men, whose names we will never know, loved each other in the trenches of the First World War. They loved in secret. They loved in fear. They loved knowing that if anyone found out, their lives would be destroyed. And they loved anyway. Because love is not something you can stop. It is not something you can hide forever. It finds a way, even in the worst circumstances, even in the middle of a war, even when the world says it is a crime. Those men deserved better. They deserved a world that let them love openly. They deserved a future. They deserved to come home and build the lives they dreamed about in the trenches. The bookshops, the farms, the cottages by the sea. Most of them did not get that. Most of them came home and went back to hiding. or they did not come home at all. But some of them survived. Some of them found each other. Some of them built lives together. Quiet lives, hidden lives, but lives. And some of them left behind enough evidence that we can piece together what happened, that we can know they existed, that we can honor them. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the gay soldiers of the First World War, the ones who fought, the ones who loved, the ones who came home and spent the rest of their lives carrying secrets no one wanted to hear. They were real, they mattered, and their love, the love that had to live in shadows, the love that could never be named, was just as real, just as important, just as worthy of being remembered as any other love in history. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of trenches, of mud, of the terror that someone might see who you really are. May you sleep knowing that the men we talked about tonight, the ones who could not live openly, would be glad to know that you can, that their silence made space for your voice, that their hiding made space for your visibility. They kept each other company in the dark. Tonight, we keep them company in return. Good night and sleep well.